how, extreme they are. But I read this quote from Obama because I think it's important to realize that relative to what's feasible and practical and what we could actually do in the United States, we're still 10 million jobs down and the federal government not helping. And so, or not trying to help. Now again, you could always argue, well, he couldn't get this past the House or whatever. Well, still, they have to try, in my opinion. And they're not trying, and why not? Because there are powerful interests, of course, as well, but there's also a powerful misunderstanding of the kind that you saw in this cartoon video. And you see, the reason it boils down to what you saw is because the federal government doesn't even have to borrow or add to the net debt of the country in order to have further stimulus, because the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, can create money. Now, in that theory, if they create money, it automatically creates inflation. And that is kind of what's in the mind of the general public, I think. I think most of the public believes most of what was in that video. But we know from historical data that's not really true. It can be true, and they love to scare German children with the hyperinflation of 80 years ago. But we don't have any such experience in the United States. And in fact, we haven't really even had double-digit inflation since the late 70s and early 80s. And that wasn't that's not a catastrophe of any sort, that kind of inflation. The catastrophe comes from trying to shrink the economy in order to avoid the policies that are actually beneficial and necessary. So how do I know this? Well, one way you can look at the U.S. is look at the last couple of years. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve has created over $2 trillion. That is, they created that money. Okay? The ECB didn't do anything like that because they're terrified of the inflation monster. All right? Well, we did do that. And, what is inflation? The latest CPI report came out today. It's 2.7% year over year. Maybe that wouldn't be good enough for the ECB, but it's actually 2.6% even in the Eurozone. If you look at core inflation, taking out food and energy, it's 2.3. So we don't have an inflation problem despite this enormous expansion of money by the federal government. Now, by the Federal Reserve. Why did the Federal Reserve do that? Because they were trying to bring down not only the short-term interest rates that they normally control, which they already brought down to basically zero since 2008, and they couldn't do more than that at the level of short-term interest rates. So they started to buy long-term Treasury securities, the mortgage-backed securities as well, and to push down the long-term interest rates as well. And so that's really, really different from what the European Central Bank is willing to do. And that's one of the reasons that they have 10.6% unemployment, and ours is, a couple points lower, the lower official rate. It's, 8.1 or 8.3. And so that's one big difference. And so we're actually pretty lucky that we have a chair of the Federal Reserve who, despite his past mistakes, not doing anything when that $8 trillion bubble was accumulating, and he was on the Federal Reserve, and since 2002 he was on the board. He realized when this recession happened that this was a situation where the Federal Reserve could create money and should create money, and he thereby gave the rest of the government the ability to pursue a more expansionary fiscal policy. And so, in other words, our Congress and executive could spend the money we need to do whatever we want here. Okay? There's no real threat of inflation, and the Federal Reserve is willing to create that money. And so we could, in fact, have a real stimulus. And it could be good things, too. We could use public transportation in this country. We could have things that actually lower energy usage in the United States. Those things are actually feasible and possible. What's holding it back is the unwillingness of the Congress to do it, and of course the willingness of the executive to go along with that kind of framework, that we really have a debt problem and a deficit problem. And of course there are a lot of other ways to look at it if you want to see why we don't have that problem in the United States. Just to give you two of the most important, you know, you'll hear people scream about how the whole gross debt is now nearly 100% of GDP, and it's huge, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. 15 trillion. Big, scary numbers. But the real number that matters is the burden of this debt on the United States government, right? How much, I mean, if you had a debt of $1 million right now, any one of you in this room, and there's no interest on it, and you could borrow to repay the principal anytime you want, if that comes due at no interest, then you don't really have a debt problem either, okay? And for countries, that's really the problem. That's how it works out. They can roll over their debt, as the United States does, and the problem is really just what is the interest burden on that debt? And so Greece has a problem because their interest burden is 6.8% of their national income. Jamaica has a bigger one because it's 10 or 11%, okay? Our interest burden is 1.4% of the U.S. economy. It's about as low as it's been since World War II, really. So it's not really a problem. So in the short run, we don't have a debt or a deficit problem. And in fact, the United States government can borrow at zero interest rates to, you know, if it wants to add to its net debt, it can borrow it at these interest rates. If it doesn't want to add to it, as I said, it can just have the Federal Reserve create the money, and then you borrow from the Federal Reserve, and then the money goes back to the Treasury. The interest goes back to the Treasury, so there's no net increase in interest. So you don't have this, you don't have a problem. Now, what about the long run? People will say, well, if you look into the future, you see big projected deficits and debts for the federal government. That's true, but only because of one thing: healthcare costs. So in the long run, our debt problem is a problem of healthcare costs. It's not a problem of federal spending of any other kind. And so you can see this. We actually have a calculator on our website, and you can go to that, and you can take any country in the world that has a higher life expectancy than us, okay, because you don't want to cheat and pick some country where people die at 50 and because they don't spend anything on health care. You take any country who has a higher life expectancy than we do, and unfortunately today that includes countries like Costa Rica, not so rich countries anymore. And unfortunately for us, we're near the bottom of the rich countries. And you can take their health care costs and put it into our budget and look at the long-run projected budget deficit, and it turns into a surplus. So you see, that shows you that unless you believe there's something really wrong with Americans and we have to spend indefinitely twice as much per person as other rich countries, we don't have a long-term deficit problem either. We have a long-term problem of healthcare costs. So there you have it. The United States in the short run and the long run has no real debt or deficit problem. The real problem we have is a problem of unemployment and unused resources and people who simply cannot